Welcome everybody to Module 6, where we're going to be discussing the skeletal system. We've already started getting into the organ systems themselves. We first talked about the integumentary system in the last module, and pretty much from here on out for the rest of the summer session, we're going to be going over some sort of organ system. The only time we won't be talking about an organ system is when we talk about the genetics chapter and the chapter on mitosis and meiosis, so the cell division and reproductive chapters. But everything else is going to be focusing on the organ system. So we really want to kind of get into the meat and potatoes, I guess you could say, of the material for the human biology class, and we're really going to kind of dive in and get through these major organ systems that are found in the human body. And so the second organ system we're going to dive into is the skeletal system. And I'm going to break this chapter into three different videos. The first is going to kind of be an overview of the skeletal system. The second one, we're going to focus on kind of how bones develop and repair themselves. And then the last video is going to focus on kind of an anatomy type video where we go through and label all of the various bones that are found throughout the human skeletal system. All right. And so with that, let's just kind of dive in and talk about the basics of the skeletal system. So the skeletal system is made up of connective tissue. And we have three types of connective tissue that is found within the skeletal system. So we have that specialized connective tissue, which is bone. And the bone is the hard elements of the skeletal system. It provides support for the body and also provides protection for some organs and other tissues that are in the body. The second type of connective tissue are ligaments, and ligaments are types of connective tissue that are really fibrous, or I should say dense fibrous connective tissue, and ligaments are there to attach bones to other bones. We will mention tendons, and we will talk about tendons a little later on. Tendons attach muscle to bone. And so ligaments are attaching bones to other bones, and so kind of keeping the skeletal system held together. And then the third type of connective tissue in the skeletal system is cartilage. And so cartilage is, again, a specialized connective tissue. It's made up of collagen. And remember from the last module, we talked about cartilage being kind of a substance that is made up of cells and a ground matrix, or a ground substance. And that ground substance is very elastic, which allows for the flexibility. And then you combine that with the collagen fibers. It makes for kind of a unique structure that has a lot of different functions around the body. We talked about how you could have cartilage that helps to kind of form the ears and the nose. But with the skeletal system, we'll talk about cartilage that's there to really cushion the impact of bones against bones. So for example, in between the vertebra and the vertebral column. But then the cartilage is also really important for reducing friction between bones and joints. And we'll talk a lot about that as we get kind of later on in the chapter. Now, we mentioned that the first type of connective tissue is the bones. And the bones are the hard part of the skeletal system. It has living tissues that have multiple different types of cells that all work together during the formation of bone and the remodeling of the bones themselves. And so throughout a majority of our lives, the bones are growing. And then once you become an adult and those bones stop growing, forces and pressures can still be applied to your bones to cause them to reshape and remodel themselves. And we'll talk specifically how that happens in the second video of this module. But first, what we're going to really look at is kind of the really big functions, the important functions of bones themselves. And so the first is support. So bones are there to support our structures, to support our organs, to support our body and our tissues. The second big function is protection. So to protect our organs and tissues from any kind of blunt force trauma that may occur from falling down or being hit by an object. So for example, our skull, it provides protection for our brain. Our rib cage provides protection for our internal organs. And so bones are there for these support and protection. Another function is movement, so it allows our bodies to move, and so the joints and the articulation of bones to other bones in conjunction with muscles allows for the movement of our bodies. And then bones are also really important for the development of blood cells. And as we'll learn in this chapter, blood is made from the red bone marrow that are found in the ends of, for example, long bones. And in that bone marrow, you have stem cells that can differentiate into different types of blood cells. So they can be red blood cells, they could be white blood cells, and then they could become one of the many different types of white blood cells. And again, we'll talk about how that development happens. And then when we get into the blood chapter, we'll talk specifically about the importance of each of those individual blood cells themselves. And then the last big function for bone is to serve as mineral storage, so specifically calcium and phosphate. So for example, if the body has too much calcium, then our body can store that calcium in our bones. And then if our bodies need calcium, there are specialized cells that will break down the calcium deposits in the bones and release that into our blood so that our body can increase calcium concentrations whenever we may need it. And so bones are really important for that mineral storage. And so just to kind of summarize, we got our big 5 functions. That is support, protection, movement, blood cell formation, and mineral storage. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is what bones are specifically made of. So we know that bones are these hard structures, right? They support and protect different tissues and organs in our body. But our bones are actually a matrix of living cells and other components. And if you look at the structure of the bone, you have what's called compact bone, and this compact bone forms the shaft, so the long portion of a bone, and the ends of a bone, okay? Now, there is a space that is inside this compact bone, and that space is called a marrow space. Okay? Now, in, say, the long portion, the shaft portion of the bone, you find what's known as yellow bone marrow. And this is mostly fatty material. In the ends of a bone, which we'll look at in a second, is where you find the red bone marrow. And that red bone marrow is where a lot of the blood cells are made. Now you also have what's known as spongy bone, and the spongy bone is where that red bone marrow is found. So this is in the ends of the bones itself. So the epiphyseus is what that location is called. And we have an image in the next slide that kind of shows that. And so there's this lattice-like structure, which is again made up of that red bone marrow, that is known as the spongy bone. So you have your compact bone, you'll have your yellow bone marrow, your red bone marrow, or that spongy bone, and then you'll also have different types of cells in the structures of the bone. And these can be osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts, and we'll talk specifically about what these are. But remember, in the last module, I said if you see the word osteo, it's referring to bone, right? So osteo is bone. Blasts are basically immature cells, and so you can think of osteoblasts as immature bone cells, and cytes are your mature cells. So your osteocytes are your mature bone cells, and then clasts are what break down bone. So osteoclasts are cells that will break down and dissolve those components of the bone, especially when you're like remodeling and reshaping bones. There are different types of bones. You have long, flat, and irregular. And when we talk about the kind of different bones that you find in the body, so the 206 bones that are found in the human body, we'll go through and we'll say, okay, these are like long bones. This is an example of a flat bone, and this is an example of an irregular bone. Now, the cells that exist in bones are arranged into this kind of specific cellular arrangement, and that cellular arrangement is referred to as an osteon or the Haversian system. Okay, and again, I have a figure on the next slide that hopefully will kind of clarify these definitions. And then the bones themselves are surrounded by a thin layer of connective tissue that's known as the periosteum. And you can see that here. And so that thin layer of connective tissue that kind of wraps around the bone, that's the periosteum. And so you have your compact bone, which is the hard area here on the outer portion of the kind of canal or hollow space inside the shaft of the bone. And that shaft is also known as the diaphysius. Okay? The ends of the bone is the epiphysius, and the ends of the bone is where you find the spongy bone. Okay? And remember, that spongy bone is where the red bone marrow is found. Inside the shaft is where you find that yellow bone marrow. And so if we did a cross section, or if we took a cross section, say of this area where this black box is, and we zoomed into it, it allows us to see the cellular arrangement a little more closely. And so you notice that there are these kind of circular arrangements inside the compact bone itself. Okay, so this area here is the compact bone, which is just this hard structure here. And then as you move inward, you get into the spongy bone, which is up top. And then on the inside, you would get into the yellow bone marrow, or that bone space inside that shaft. But now what I want to point out with this kind of circular cellular arrangement, one unit of that, or cellular arrangement, is referred to as an osteon. Okay, and so we're going to zoom in to kind of this osteon, and you can see this circular arrangement, right? And then on the inside, you'll kind of have like another one, and you'll have another one, right? So that's basically what we're seeing here. So here's that circle, right? You have another circle, right? And so this kind of hierarchy of circles are the osteon, which is also known as the Haversian system. Okay. Now within these circles, let me erase some of this stuff. Within these circles, you'll see these dark spots here. Okay. These dark spots are the mature bone cells. These are the osteocytes. So you can see that here. Right? So those are your osteocytes. Now, if we zoom in to an osteocyte, right, which is right here, this image. You can see that osteocyte, so that bone cell, and the osteocyte is in this space, which is called the lacuna. Okay, so that space that the osteocyte is in is the lacuna. And so here you're looking at a single osteocyte in that lacuna. Now, each osteocyte connects to one another through these cytoplasmic extensions into these spaces in the bone kind of matrix. And those cytoplasmic extensions are these lines, these connecting lines between the dark osteocytes. Right? These connecting lines are called canacula. Okay? So basically what you have is you have a osteocyte that is inside of the lacuna. Okay, so I'm just going to draw that around. And then you'll have these other canacula that would connect to other lacuna. Right, kind of in this circular fashion. And those connections, right, allow those cells to remain in contact with one another. And that's the circles that you're seeing here. Okay, so you're looking at osteocytes in lacuna that are connected to one another via the canacula. Okay? And then in the center, and so I should first say that several of these circular connections make up an osteon. Right, so this one unit here is an osteon, and you would kind of have another osteon, which would be like right here, another osteon, which would be like right there. Now notice in the center here you have this canal, so this central canal. That central canal is where the blood vessels and the nerves run through the bone. Okay? And so that central canal is important for bringing the blood supply into the bone, and then that can travel into the adjacent osteocytes. Okay. All right. And so that's kind of the structure and the makeup of bones in a general sense. And you'll want to know what the osteon is, the osteocytes, the central canal, the lacuna, the canacula, and then the Haversian system, which is referring to those osteons. Okay. All right. So, like we mentioned, bones or the skeletal system is made up of bones, ligaments, and cartilage. And so we've just finished discussing bones. Ligaments is there to hold bones together. So it's attaching bones to other bones, made of very dense, fibrous connective tissue, and it's providing strength, but it's also flexible enough for that movement to happen in our appendages that allow us to move our arms, to jump, to hop, skip, run, etc. Okay, so those ligaments are very, very important. And then the final component of our skeletal system is the cartilage. And in the skeletal system specifically, cartilage is providing support, especially in those areas where you have pressure and forces that are acting on the bones. And there are a couple of different types of cartilage that you can find throughout the skeletal system. You can have a fibrocartilage, which is cartilage that you find between the vertebra, or for example, the meniscus that's in your knees. And so kind of that disc of cartilage in your knees. And these are there to basically provide cushioning and support between the bones in those areas. So for example, you have 2 vertebrae with a intervertebral disc, and then you have 2 vertebrae with a that helps to prevent those vertebrae from grinding against one another whenever you're walking upright or jumping up and down, or having some kind of force put on your spine. The meniscus does the same thing in the knee. It prevents the bones in the knee from pressing and grinding against one another. The second type of cartilage that you'll see in the skeletal system is called a haline cartilage. So haline cartilage is really important whenever bones are developing. And the haline cartilage forms the embryonic structure, or the earlier kind of models of what the bones will eventually be. And then that haline cartilage will eventually turn into bone, and then those bones will continue to elongate and develop as the individuals grow and get older. Another function of the haline cartilage is that on the end of the long bones and joints, they cover the ends of those bones to serve as a protection from the movement of the bones against one another. So it reduces that friction, providing protection as those bones move, say in our knees and our elbows, to prevent those bones from grinding and damaging one another. And then the last type of cartilage that we have in our skeletal system is the elastic cartilage. So you have like your epiglottis, you have more flexible, and then this is the type of cartilage that you'll find in, you can say like your outer ear or your nose. Okay. All right, and so that's basically it for the kind of introduction to the skeletal system, where we kind of just define what is the skeletal system, the components that make up the skeletal system, so the bones, the ligaments, and the cartilage. In the next video for this chapter, we're going to really look at how bones develop and how they restructure and remodel themselves as we kind of continue to grow throughout our lives. Okay? So with that, we'll see you in the next video.